She was born into a fortune so large it could buy entire city blocks. And then she disappeared from the world that created her. For more than half a century, a woman worth over $300 million lived in a way no one could fully explain. She owned mansions she never slept in, rooms filled with priceless art she rarely touched, and a name powerful enough to open any door in America, yet she chose to close every single one herself. Her name was Hugette Clark. No scandals splashed across tabloids, no dramatic downfall, no public meltdown. That's what makes this story disturbing. While the world obsessed over celebrity excess, she quietly erased herself. She stopped attending parties. She stopped appearing in public. Eventually, she stopped living in her own homes. Instead, she moved into a hospital and stayed there for decades. Doctors said she didn't need to be there. Nurses said she was polite, distant, and impossibly private. Lawyers circled. Accountants waited. Strangers wrote letters asking for money, friendship, or simply proof that she still existed. She answered almost no one. Imagine this for a moment. You inherit a fortune larger than most people can comprehend. You could travel anywhere, love anyone, become anything, and yet you choose a life where no one is allowed inside. Not physically, not emotionally, not even historically. There were rumors, of course, that she was afraid of the outside world, that she was manipulated by people she trusted, that she was hiding something too painful to face. But the most unsettling question was always the same. What makes a woman with everything choose nothing? Because this isn't a story about shyness or eccentric wealth. This is a story about control, fear, and a decision so extreme that it turned money into a prison instead of freedom. A story where silence lasted longer than most lives. A story where the real mystery isn't how she lived, but why she refused to be seen at all. And once you understand what she gave up, you may never look at inheritance the same way again. Introduce, setting, and subject. To understand how a woman could vanish in plain sight, you first have to understand the world she was born into. She didn't grow up rich in the modern sense. This wasn't celebrity money earned and lost in a single generation. This was old, immovable wealth, industrial wealth. The kind of money that doesn't chase attention because attention eventually comes to it anyway. Her father, William Andrews Clark, was one of the richest men in America at the turn of the 20th century, a copper baron, a U.S. senator, a man whose name was etched into buildings, institutions, and power structures that still exist today. He didn't just make money, he shaped the environment around him. When he built something, it stayed. By the time she was born, the fortune was already mythological. Hundreds of millions of dollars in early 20th century terms, mansions in New York and California, a private art collection that rivaled museums, influence that moved quietly through boardrooms and politics without needing introductions. She was born late in her father's life, fragile and closely guarded. From the beginning, she was not raised to be seen. She was raised to be protected. This matters more than it sounds. Her childhood was defined by isolation long before she chose it herself. Tutors instead of classrooms, controlled environments instead of playgrounds, a life where privacy wasn't a preference but a rule. Her father believed the world was dangerous, predatory, unworthy of his daughter, and he had the money to enforce that belief. When he died, he didn't just leave her a fortune, he left her a blueprint for how to live with it. And that blueprint was built on distance. In the early years, she did what was expected. She appeared occasionally. She lived quietly, but not invisibly. She was known in certain circles as gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply reserved. She loved dolls, miniatures, and music. She collected objects not for display, but for personal meaning. There was nothing scandalous about her behavior. If anything, people found her oddly old-fashioned, even by the standards of the time. But something was already forming beneath the surface. Because money like this does something subtle to a person. It removes urgency, it removes consequences, and eventually, it removes witnesses. She never had to explain herself, never had to justify absence, never had to perform normalcy for survival. If she didn't want to attend an event, the event simply happened without her. If she didn't want to answer questions, no one could force her to. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her world began to shrink. Friends became acquaintances. Acquaintances became letters. Letters went unanswered. Her homes, once full of staff and movement, became sealed environments where time barely registered. Entire floors untouched for decades. Rooms preserved like frozen moments, as if waiting for someone who never returned. What made this stranger was that she wasn't hiding from scandal. There was no great disgrace driving her inward, no ruined reputation, no public humiliation. She wasn't running away from the world because it rejected her. She rejected it first. And then came the decision that truly confused everyone. She moved into a hospital, not for weeks, not for recovery. She moved in as if it were a residence, year after year, decade after decade, while her mansions sat empty, while her wealth continued to grow, while lawyers, distant relatives, and institutions watched in disbelief. Doctors said she could leave. She refused. Staff noticed she wasn't delusional. She was coherent, articulate, polite. She paid her bills. She followed routines. She simply chose not to go anywhere else. That choice unsettled people more than madness ever could. Because madness explains itself. Choice does not. As time passed, the questions grew darker. Who had access to her? Who spoke for her? Who benefited from her silence? A small circle of professionals slowly took control of her affairs. Some would later insist they were protecting her wishes. Others would argue those wishes were shaped, nudged, even quietly exploited. And hovering over all of it was a haunting possibility. What if this wasn't safety? What if this was retreat so complete that it erased not just her presence, but her voice? She lived long enough to see the modern world emerge without ever participating in it. Television, jet travel, cultural revolutions. Entire generations rose and fell while she remained in the same place, surrounded by white walls, untouched art, and unanswered questions. By the time the public rediscovered her story, she was already a legend without a face. The richest woman no one could reach. The heiress who refused to live like one. The ghost sitting on a fortune she never spent. And the deeper people looked, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, fear, and a childhood that taught her the outside world was something to be survived, not entered. And soon, those quiet choices would collide with reality in a way no amount of wealth could contain. Rise and fall narrative. The early years of her adulthood looked deceptively stable from the outside. Quiet, yes. Withdrawn, certainly. But still anchored to a recognizable life. She lived among her possessions, managed her affairs through trusted intermediaries, and maintained just enough contact with the world to reassure those watching from a distance that everything was fine. But stability was an illusion, built on habit, not connection. Her father, William Andrews Clark, had spent his life controlling environments, mines, railroads, politics, architecture. When he turned that instinct toward parenthood, it shaped her entire emotional geography. Love came wrapped in protection. Safety came with isolation. Independence was never taught because it was never required. So when he died, what she inherited was not only money, but a void. And unlike most people, she didn't rush to fill it. At first, the retreat was subtle. Fewer public appearances, longer stretches of silence, entire seasons passing without her leaving home. People assumed this was grief or temperament. The wealthy are allowed eccentricity, especially when it's quiet. But then came the first real fracture. She stopped living in her own spaces. It wasn't announced. There was no explanation. One day she simply stayed longer at a hospital than expected, then longer still. Days became weeks. Weeks turned into years. Eventually, it became clear that this was no temporary arrangement. Her homes remained fully staffed, meticulously maintained, and completely unused. Beds never slept in. Dining rooms untouched. Artworks sitting in darkness, their value climbing, while their owner chose fluorescent lighting and hospital routines instead. This is where the story shifts from unusual to unsettling, because there was no medical reason compelling her to stay. Doctors evaluated her repeatedly. She was physically capable of leaving, mentally coherent. She understood her finances, recognized people, held conversations with clarity and intelligence. She paid her bills promptly. She made decisions deliberately, which meant this wasn't confinement. It was choice. And that choice triggered a chain reaction. The longer she stayed, the smaller her world became. The fewer people she saw, the easier it was for a handful of voices to become the only voices that mattered. Lawyers, accountants, advisors, people whose livelihoods depended on access. People who insisted they were protecting her privacy while simultaneously managing hundreds of millions of dollars on her behalf. No one forced her to sign anything against her will. That was the defense. But no one encouraged her to re-enter life either. And somewhere in that silence, power quietly shifted. The outside world began to speculate. Some saw her as tragic, others as manipulative. There were whispers that she was being controlled. Counter whispers that she controlled everyone by refusing to participate. The truth was likely far more uncomfortable. She had learned that disappearing was the safest form of agency she knew. The hospital offered structure without demand, routine without exposure, human presence without intimacy. It was a place where she could exist without being seen, where no one expected her to perform a role, host a guest, or justify her solitude. But every retreat has a cost. As the years passed, her fortune continued to grow untouched. She spent almost nothing of significance. Entire collections remained unseen, undocumented, locked away. Institutions that could have benefited from her patronage waited. Distant relatives grew restless. Legal questions multiplied. And with each unanswered question, the tension increased. Because money without visibility invites suspicion. Was she being exploited? Was she being protected? Was she complicit in her own disappearance? Or was this the final expression of a life trained to believe that the world outside was always more dangerous than the one inside? There was no dramatic collapse, no scandalous headline, no single moment where everything fell apart. Instead, there was a slow erosion. A life narrowing so gradually that by the time anyone realized how extreme it had become, it was already irreversible. She had risen into wealth without ever stepping fully into life, and now, without ever falling publicly, she was vanishing completely. And soon, the silence surrounding her would break in ways no one could control. Dark truth revealed. Emotional peak. When the truth finally began to surface, it didn't arrive as a confession. It arrived as paperwork, court documents, medical evaluations, testimonies from people who had spent years orbiting her life without ever truly entering it. What emerged wasn't a single villain or a clean betrayal, but something far more disturbing. A system built on silence, enabled by choice, and protected by wealth. For years, she had been described as fragile, delicate, easily overwhelmed. That narrative became convenient. It justified why she stayed hidden, why decisions were made for her, why the same small group of professionals spoke on her behalf again and again. But when independent doctors finally examined her, their conclusions shattered the myth. She was mentally competent. She understood numbers. She understood contracts. She understood consequences. She knew where she was and why she was there. She knew the size of her fortune. She knew who managed it. And that revelation changed everything. Because if she was competent, then no one was holding her prisoner, which meant the prison was internal. Behind closed doors, staff described a woman who was polite but unreachable. She followed routines meticulously, meals at the same time, conversations kept brief, emotional distance maintained with surgical precision. She rarely spoke about her past, never about her fears, almost never about leaving. When asked why she stayed, her answers were vague. She felt safe. She felt comfortable. She didn't want disruption. Comfort became the shield that protected a far darker truth. Her isolation had become self-sustaining. The fewer people she allowed in, the harder it became to let anyone else close. Each year reinforced the next. The hospital was no longer a place she stayed. It was the boundary she used to keep the world out. Meanwhile, her estate became a battlefield waiting for a war that hadn't started yet. Millions were spent annually on staff, security, and management of properties she never visited. Entire mansions sat sealed, untouched for decades, as if preserved for a return that never came. Artworks of enormous cultural value remained locked away, unseen by scholars or the public. Those around her insisted they were honoring her wishes. But the question no one could answer was this: were those wishes freely formed, Or were they the final outcome of a lifetime conditioned to believe that disappearance was survival? Media attention exploded once her story became public. Headlines painted her as a mystery, a cautionary tale, a symbol of extreme wealth turned inward. Some journalists framed her as tragic, others as manipulative. Many couldn't decide whether to pity her or resent her. What no one could deny was this: she had erased herself more completely than any scandal ever could. There were moments that pierced the emotional armor, small details that felt unbearable in their quietness. She sent gifts to people she hadn't seen in years, accompanied by brief notes written in careful handwriting. She maintained interest in dolls and miniatures, worlds small enough to control, frozen in perfect order. In those details, something devastating became clear. She hadn't chosen emptiness. She had chosen safety at the cost of connection. And the longer it lasted, the harder it became to imagine another way of living. When authorities finally intervened to examine her circumstances, it was too late to undo the pattern. Even with full autonomy confirmed, nothing changed. She stayed. The hospital remained her home. The world remained outside. Because by then, leaving would have required something more terrifying than isolation. It would have required beginning, and beginnings were something she had never been taught how to survive. Channel's opinion, legends, and secret style. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because of what others did to her, but because of what her life forces us to confront about freedom, choice, and responsibility. It's easy to look for villains here, to point at lawyers, advisors, doctors, and systems that quietly benefited from her disappearance. And yes, there were failures, ethical gray zones, people who should have asked harder questions and didn't, people who grew used to managing a fortune without ever truly engaging with the person behind it. But reducing this story to exploitation alone would be a mistake, because the most unsettling truth is that she was not powerless. She was competent, she was informed, she had options most people could never dream of, and yet she consistently chose the smallest possible life. That forces an uncomfortable question. What if extreme wealth doesn't free you, but removes the need to confront fear? Most people are pushed into the world by necessity. Workforces, interaction, survival demands, engagement, even trauma often gets interrupted by the need to function. But she had no such pressure. Her fortune insulated her not only from danger, but from growth. And in that insulation, fear was allowed to settle in and become permanent. There's also something deeply revealing about the way her story fascinates us. We don't just want to know what happened to her. We want reassurance that we wouldn't make the same choice, that if we had her money, we'd live louder, fuller, braver lives. But would we? Or would we, given unlimited safety, slowly retreat from anything that might hurt us? Her life challenges the romantic idea of inheritance. It exposes the lie that money automatically equals freedom. In her case, money removed friction so completely that nothing ever forced her to re-enter life once she stepped away from it. She wasn't destroyed by scandal. She wasn't ruined by addiction. She wasn't silenced by abuse. She simply stopped participating. And that may be the most frightening outcome of all. So here's the question I want to leave with you. Do you see her as tragic or as autonomous? Was she a woman quietly trapped by a system that benefited from her absence? Or was she someone who exercised the only form of control she understood, even if it looked like disappearance from the outside? And what does it say about us that we're more disturbed by a woman choosing nothing than by countless stories of people forced into ruin? Because her life suggests something we rarely want to admit. Sometimes, the most dangerous prison is the one that never locks the door. Open ending, nostalgia. She died quietly, the way she had lived for decades. No final interview, no dramatic revelation, no sudden return to the world she had abandoned. When the news reached the public, it felt less like a death and more like confirmation of something that had already happened long ago. By the time she was gone, her fortune had outlived her presence. Mansions were open for the first time in years. Doors unlocked, dust-covered rooms revealed untouched furniture, sealed letters, and objects waiting patiently for an owner who never came back. Artworks emerged from darkness into light, finally seen by people who had only known them as numbers on a balance sheet. And yet, none of it explained her. Because legacy isn't measured only by what is left behind, but by what was never lived. Her story doesn't offer easy lessons. It doesn't fit into the familiar arc of rise, scandal, and redemption. There is no villain to defeat, no clear injustice to correct. Just a woman who chose safety so completely that the world slowly stopped knocking. Some will say she wasted her life. Others will argue she lived exactly as she wished. The truth may be something more unsettling than either. Perhaps she lived the life she was trained for. A life where isolation was love, where control meant survival, where being unseen felt safer than being known. Her wealth will be remembered, her art will be studied, her name will appear in museums, archives, and footnotes of American history. But the person herself remains unreachable, even now. And maybe that was always the point. Some stories aren't built to inspire. They exist to unsettle, to force us to question the assumptions we make about success, freedom, and choice, to remind us that money can build walls just as easily as it opens doors. She was born into $300 million, and she chose a life no one could enter. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now, she had more money than most people would ever see in a lifetime, and she died over a rent dispute. That sentence alone should make you pause. Because when you hear $12 million trust fund, you imagine safety. You imagine lawyers on speed dial, powerful friends, a name that opens doors and closes problems before they even begin. You imagine a woman who is untouchable. But that illusion is exactly what killed Nancy Pfister. I want you to picture this: a woman who dined with presidents, who partied with Hunter S. Thompson, who once turned down a marriage proposal from Michael Douglas, who grew up in a world where Aspen wasn't a ski town yet, but a playground being built by her own family. Nancy Pfister didn't just live in Aspen. Her family helped create it. Her father co-founded the Buttermilk Ski Area and transformed a dying mining town into one of the most exclusive destinations on Earth. At her peak, you didn't ask, who owns Aspen? You asked, do you know Nancy Pfister? Everyone did. And that was the problem. Because when everyone knows your name, they also think they know who you are. They think your wealth makes you arrogant, that your privilege makes you careless, that your money makes you immune to consequences. But here's the secret no one talks about. Nancy Pfister wasn't killed by greed. She wasn't killed by jealousy. She wasn't killed by some grand criminal mastermind. She was killed because she trusted the wrong people with the keys to her house. In today's story, I want to take you behind the polished surface of old money, behind the ski resorts, the champagne, the famous last name, because this isn't just a murder story. This is a story about how being rich can make you visible and how being visible can make you vulnerable. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why $12 million couldn't save her. Let me take you back to Aspen, Colorado, before it became a brand, before it became a backdrop for luxury magazines and Instagram fantasies, back when Aspen was still rough around the edges, when the mountains felt wild and unsupervised, and the people who arrived there believed they were pioneers of a new kind of American paradise. This was the world Nancy Pfister was born into. Aspen wasn't just her hometown, it was her inheritance. Her father wasn't a passive investor or a distant millionaire. He was one of the men who helped build the town's future with his own hands and his own vision, co-founding the Buttermilk Ski Area and transforming Aspen from a forgotten mining settlement into a magnet for wealth, fame, and power. When the snow fell, money followed, and when money followed, influence arrived, and Nancy grew up right at the center of it. By the time she reached adulthood, she didn't need to introduce herself. Her last name did the work for her. In Aspen's tight social circle, being a Pfister meant you were part of the town's DNA. You weren't a visitor, you weren't a guest, you were legacy. She inherited a trust fund estimated at around $12 million, not flashy billionaire money, but old money, quiet money, the kind that sits in the background and whispers instead of shouting, enough to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes, enough to never worry about rent, arguments, or small disputes, and yet, ironically, it was rent that would end her life. Nancy's lifestyle reflected the contradictions of old money. She wasn't obsessed with showing off. She wasn't chasing attention. She was known for being social, charismatic, sometimes difficult, sometimes generous, often blunt. People described her as complicated, warm one moment, abrasive the next, someone who could host legendary dinners and then disappear for weeks. She moved easily among celebrities and politicians, but she was never impressed by them. Fame didn't intimidate her because she'd grown up surrounded by it. She had relationships, flirtations, near marriages, but she never fully settled into a conventional role. No husband, no children, no carefully curated image. Aspen knew her as a fixture, someone who belonged there as much as the mountains themselves. But here's where the theme of this story quietly begins to take shape. When you live in a place where everyone knows you, boundaries blur, familiarity replaces caution, power dynamics get distorted, people stop seeing danger because danger doesn't look dangerous anymore. It looks like neighbors, like friends, like tenants. Nancy owned a house in Aspen that she decided to rent out. On paper, this was nothing. A minor financial decision for a woman of her wealth, a casual agreement, a handshake-level arrangement compared to the deals happening around her every day. But this wasn't just a rental. This was an invitation into her private space. And when things started to go wrong, when the rent dispute escalated, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an annoyance, something that would be resolved the way everything else in her life always had been, through conversation, through pressure, through the quiet authority of her name. That assumption would cost her everything. Because this story isn't about Aspen's glamour. It's about what happens when old money meets entitlement, resentment, and access. It's about how the illusion of safety can be more dangerous than poverty because it convinces you that nothing truly bad can happen to you. And as we move forward, I want you to keep one thought in your mind. The people who killed Nancy Pfister didn't break into her world. They were already inside it. For most of her life, nothing truly threatened Nancy Pfister. Problems came and went the way they always do when money cushions the fall. Arguments ended with drinks. Conflicts dissolved after a few phone calls. In Aspen, reputation mattered. And Nancy's reputation was deeply embedded in the town's history. She was difficult, yes, stubborn, absolutely, but she was also untouchable. Or at least that's what everyone believed, including Nancy herself. She trusted familiarity more than fear. She trusted the past more than instinct, and that trust shaped one decision that seemed insignificant at the time. She rented her house, not because she needed the money. The rent was irrelevant compared to her trust fund. This was convenience, not necessity. She allowed a couple to live in her home while she stayed elsewhere, assuming it would be temporary, manageable, uncomplicated. It wasn't. The tenants fell behind on rent, excuses piled up, deadlines passed, conversations turned tense. What should have been a routine landlord issue began to carry emotional weight, because in Nancy's world, money disputes weren't about survival, they were about respect, and she felt disrespected. She pushed back, she demanded payment, she made it clear that she was done being patient. To her, this was asserting boundaries. To them, it felt like pressure, humiliation, exposure. They weren't arguing with a landlord, they were confronting Aspen royalty. And that imbalance mattered more than anyone realized. As the dispute escalated, resentment grew quietly, not explosive, not dramatic, just simmering, the kind that feeds on perceived injustice, on the idea that someone else has everything while you're fighting to keep a roof over your head. Nancy didn't see danger. She saw stubbornness. She believed authority would prevail as it always had. She underestimated how desperation can twist logic, how shame can turn into rage, how proximity can breed obsession. Then came the decision that sealed her fate. She returned to the house. She didn't bring security. She didn't bring friends. She didn't alert anyone that she was staying there. Why would she? It was her home. Her name was on everything. The idea that she could be in danger inside her own property didn't even cross her mind. This is the moment where the story tilts. Because while Nancy believed the conflict was still negotiable, the people on the other side had crossed a psychological line. What had begun as a rent dispute had transformed into something darker, something personal. They didn't see a wealthy woman asserting her rights. They saw an obstacle standing between them and survival, between them and control. What happened next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a sudden outburst of violence. It was a decision. Nancy was murdered inside her own home. The details are disturbing, not because of how brutal they were, but because of how unnecessary it all was. $12 million, decades of legacy, a life filled with access and opportunity, ended over an amount of money she wouldn't have noticed missing. When the news broke, Aspen froze. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not to someone like her. Murders belonged to other places, other lives, other social classes. This shattered the illusion that wealth created immunity. And as investigators peeled back the layers, the story became even more unsettling. The killers weren't strangers. They weren't faceless criminals lurking in the dark. They were people she knew, people she had allowed into her space, people who had learned her routines, her habits, her sense of safety. The rise and fall of Nancy Pfister wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no sudden scandal, no public disgrace, no slow descent into chaos. There was just one miscalculation, believing that money could replace caution. And in the aftermath, Aspen was left asking a question it had never seriously considered before. If someone like Nancy Pfister could be killed so easily, what did safety even mean anymore? When the investigation began, the town wanted a clean story, a simple explanation, a random act of violence that could be neatly folded away so Aspen could return to sleep. But the truth refused to stay quiet. Because the deeper authorities looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't chaos. It was familiarity turned lethal. Nancy's body was found inside the very house she believed she still controlled. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no dramatic break-in, the kind of scene that tells you immediately what went wrong before anyone even speaks it out loud. She had let them in. What followed felt less like a police case and more like a slow unraveling of assumptions. The people responsible weren't hiding in the shadows of the town. They were already known, already connected to her daily life, already aware of her movements, her habits, her trust. The rent dispute was no longer a side detail. It became the spine of the story. Investigators learned that the conflict had grown increasingly bitter, conversations had turned cold, tensions had hardened into something personal. For Nancy, it was about principle, about refusing to be taken advantage of, about drawing a line and expecting it to be respected. For the others, it was something else entirely. It was humiliation, fear, the pressure of being exposed, the realization that they were about to lose not just a place to live, but the illusion that they still had control over their lives. And when control disappears, people don't always act rationally. The murder itself wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was disturbingly intimate. The kind of violence that happens when emotions have been building quietly for too long, when resentment has time to mature, when anger stops shouting and starts calculating. What shocked the public wasn't just that Nancy had been killed. It was how ordinary the motive was. Not revenge, not greed, not a grand inheritance plot, just rent, just a dispute that could have been resolved with a check, a lawyer, or time. Instead, it ended with a life erased and multiple lives destroyed. When arrests were made, Aspen's reaction was visceral. This wasn't an outsider crime. This wasn't something the town could blame on poverty or distance or unfamiliar faces. This was internal, homegrown, a fracture inside its own myth. Media coverage swarmed the case, but there was an awkward hesitation in the tone. Reporters struggled to reconcile the image of an untouchable socialite with the reality of her vulnerability. Headlines whispered what people were afraid to say out loud. If old money couldn't protect her, what did it really protect? People began revisiting memories, replaying conversations, questioning moments that once seemed harmless. Some remembered Nancy as generous, others as sharp-tongued. Some admired her independence, others resented her authority. In death, she became a mirror, reflecting everyone's unresolved feelings about privilege, entitlement, and power. And maybe the most unsettling detail of all was this. Nancy didn't die because she was careless. She died because she believed the rules of her world still applied. She believed reputation mattered. She believed ownership meant authority. She believed familiarity equaled safety. Those beliefs had carried her through decades of life without serious consequence until the day they didn't. And when the truth finally settled, when the case was no longer speculation but fact, Aspen was forced to accept something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just a murder. It was the collapse of an illusion. When I look at Nancy Pfister's story, I don't see a careless woman or a foolish mistake. I see something far more unsettling. A system of belief that quietly teaches wealthy people the wrong lessons about safety. Because from the outside, Nancy had everything society tells us equals protection, money, legacy, social power, a name that carried weight in every room she entered. And yet none of that mattered when the danger came from inside the circle she trusted. This is where I want to be very clear with you. Nancy Pfister wasn't arrogant for thinking she was safe. She was conditioned to believe it. When you grow up in a world where problems dissolve because of who you are, you stop recognizing risk as something personal, threats feel theoretical, consequences feel negotiable. Old money doesn't teach you how to survive danger. It teaches you how to assume danger will never arrive. That's the uncomfortable truth behind this case. We love stories about wealth as armor, gated homes, security systems, powerful connections, but none of those protect you from resentment that has time to grow in close proximity. None of them protect you from people who know your routines, your habits, your blind spots. Nancy's killers didn't defeat her strength, they exploited her assumptions. And this is where public opinion often becomes cruel. After tragedies like this, people ask the wrong questions. Why didn't she just evict them sooner? Why didn't she call the police? Why didn't she bring security? Those questions assume hindsight is wisdom. But in real life, danger rarely announces itself as danger. It arrives disguised as inconvenience, as annoyance, as a dispute you believe you've handled before. Nancy didn't feel threatened, she felt irritated, and that distinction matters. Her story also exposes something else we rarely discuss: the resentment wealth can quietly create, not the loud, obvious envy, but the slow-burning kind, the kind that forms when someone feels small next to your power, invisible next to your name, replaceable next to your resources. In those conditions, a simple disagreement stops being about money and starts being about dignity. And when dignity feels attacked, people can justify the unthinkable. This channel doesn't exist to glorify tragedy. It exists to examine the cracks beneath the surface, to question the myths we're taught to admire. Nancy Pfister's life forces us to confront one of the hardest truths about privilege. Wealth can isolate you, familiarity can deceive you, and safety is never guaranteed, no matter how high the price tag. I want to know what you think. Do you see this as a tragic accident of trust, or as an inevitable consequence of a system that teaches people they are untouchable? Was this preventable, or was it simply the moment when illusion finally met reality? Your perspective matters, because stories like this don't end when the case is closed. They continue in the questions we ask and the lessons we choose to ignore. Nancy Pfister didn't disappear in a blaze of scandal or a long public downfall. She vanished the way many people with quiet power do, suddenly, privately, and in a way that leaves more questions than answers. There was no final interview, no public confession, no moment where she got to explain herself. One day, she was a permanent fixture of Aspen. The next, she became a headline people whispered about with disbelief. And then, slowly, she became a memory the town didn't quite know how to hold. Aspen moved on the way wealthy places always do. The ski seasons returned, the tourists came back, new names replaced old ones, but something had shifted beneath the surface. A subtle awareness that money doesn't erase danger, it just changes its shape. Nancy's legacy isn't found in buildings or trust funds or family names carved into history. It lives in the silence that followed her death, in the uncomfortable realization that privilege can dull instinct, that familiarity can be fatal, that the most dangerous threats don't always come from strangers in the dark, but from people standing inside your life, smiling, waiting. Her story leaves us with no neat moral, no satisfying resolution, just a haunting aftertaste. $12 million couldn't buy her another morning. A famous name couldn't unlock a second chance. A lifetime of access couldn't protect her from one ordinary conflict taken too far. Some stories were never meant to be known. They stayed buried under reputation, under wealth, under the illusion of safety. But this one surfaced anyway, forcing us to look directly at something we'd rather ignore: that safety is never guaranteed, that power doesn't equal control, and that even the most protected lives can end in the most unprotected moments. Now you know her story. And once you know it, it's hard to believe in the myth of invulnerability ever again. For 25 years, a woman lived in total darkness while the world above her continued to laugh, fall in love, and forget. I want you to imagine this for a moment. Not a prison built by the state. Not chains, not bars, not guards. Just a locked bedroom in a respectable house in a quiet French city, owned by one of the most honorable families of their time. And inside that room, slowly disappearing from history, was Blanche. Monnier. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't insane. She didn't commit murder, theft, or betrayal. Her crime was much simpler. She fell in love with the wrong man, and she refused to obey her mother. That single act of defiance erased her existence for a quarter of a century, while Paris celebrated art, progress, and modernity. While the Belle Epoque praised elegance and morality, Blanche Monnier was rotting in a proper 5 sealed room, surrounded by filth, insects, and silence. No mirrors, no sunlight, no human touch. People spoke her name at dinner parties, but only as a mystery. She ran. Away, they said. She chose another life, they whispered. Some even admired her supposed rebellion, but the truth was far worse. Because Blanche didn't escape society, she was erased by it. And the most terrifying part, everyone who mattered lived just outside that locked door. Tonight, I'm not telling you a ghost story. I'm telling you something more disturbing, a true story about love, control, social reputation, and how a mother's obsession with honor turned her own daughter into a living corpse. This is not just the story of Blanche Monnier. It's a story about what happens when obedience matters more than humanity. For 25 years, a woman lived in total darkness while the world above her continued to laugh, fall in love, and forget. I want you to imagine this for a moment. Not a prison built by the state, not chains, not bars, not guards. Just a locked bedroom in a respectable house in a quiet French city owned by one of the most honorable families of their time. And inside that room, slowly disappearing from history, was Blanche Monnier. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't insane. She didn't commit murder, theft, or betrayal. Her crime was much simpler. She fell in love with the wrong man, and she refused to obey her mother. That single act of defiance erased her existence for a quarter of a century. While Paris celebrated art, progress, and modernity, while the Belle Epoque praised elegance and morality, Blanche Monnier was rotting in a sealed room, surrounded by filth, insects, and silence. No mirrors, no sunlight, no human touch. People spoke her name at dinner parties, but only as a mystery. She ran. Away, they said. She chose another life, they whispered. Some even admired her supposed rebellion, but the truth was far worse. Because Blanche didn't escape society, she was erased by it. And the most terrifying part, everyone who mattered lived just outside that locked door. Tonight, I'm not telling you a ghost story. I'm telling you something more disturbing, a true story about love, control, social reputation, and how a mother's obsession with honor turned her own daughter into a living corpse. This is not just the story of Blanche Monnier. It's a story about what happens when obedience matters more than humanity. Before the door was locked, Blanche Monnier's life followed a path that looked almost perfect from the outside. She was born into comfort, not extravagance, but security, the kind of life where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. As a young woman, Blanche moved easily through polite society. She attended gatherings, exchanged pleasantries, learned music and manners. People saw her as gentle, quiet, and compliant. No one imagined her as rebellious. No one imagined her as dangerous. And that is what makes her fall so unsettling, because Blanche did not fall through scandal, she fell through love. At some point in her 20s, Blanche met a man her mother despised. He was not violent. He was not immoral. He was simply unsuitable, older, financially unstable, and lacking the social standing Louise Monnier demanded. To Blanche, he represented something forbidden: choice. She wanted to marry him, not negotiate, not wait, not compromise. She wanted her own life. That moment was the beginning of the end. At first, the conflict stayed verbal. Arguments behind closed doors, raised voices, tears, ultimatums. Louise demanded obedience. Blanche refused. And here is where the story turns dark in a way that still chills me. Because Louise did not lose control in a fit of rage. She calculated, she understood the system she lived in. A single woman dependent on her family. No independent income, no legal protection from parental authority. Blanche's refusal placed her outside the acceptable order of things. So Louise chose the quietest solution possible. She removed Blanche from sight. The door to Blanche's bedroom was locked. The shutters were sealed, and the world went on. In the early days, Blanche likely believed it would end, that this was pressure, not a life sentence, that eventually her mother would relent. But the days did not soften Louise. They hardened her. Meals became scarce. Light disappeared. Conversation stopped. Blanche's room turned into a sealed ecosystem of decay. Food scraps attracted rats. Insects multiplied. The stench became permanent. And still, no one intervened. Louise's son, Marcel Monnier, lived in the same house. And this is where the story becomes even more disturbing, because Marcel knew. He grew up. He aged. He pursued his own life. And all the while, his sister remained locked above him. There are no heroic acts here, no secret attempts to free her, no resistance, only silence. Years passed, then decades. Blanche's body adapted to darkness in ways that feel almost inhuman. Her eyes became painfully sensitive to light. Her muscles atrophied. Her mind retreated inward. Time lost meaning. Imagine not knowing whether it is morning or night. Imagine never seeing your reflection for years. Imagine hearing voices downstairs but never being spoken to. This wasn't imprisonment with purpose. It was slow erasure. The decline was total. Blanche did not lose her beauty. She lost her humanity. By the time authorities would later find her, she weighed barely more than a child. Her hair was matted. Her nails grew unchecked. Her body was covered in filth. But the most tragic detail is this: she was still alive. Not numb, not unconscious, alive. She reacted to voices. She responded to kindness. This wasn't a woman who had disappeared mentally. This was a woman who had endured. And all of it happened while her mother continued to attend social events, donate to charities, and receive public recognition for her morality. That contrast is unbearable, because while Blanche was deteriorating upstairs, Louise Monnier was being praised downstairs. What began as a punishment became a system, a routine, a secret so normalized that it no longer felt shocking to those who lived with it. The decline wasn't just Blanche's. It was the moral collapse of an entire household. And soon, that collapse would no longer stay hidden, because secrets like this do not disappear. They rot. And eventually, they smell too strong to ignore. The truth didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with a letter, an anonymous letter. No signature, no emotion, just a few lines written with enough clarity to force action. It claimed that a woman had been locked inside a house in Poitiers for decades, starved, hidden, forgotten. At first, authorities hesitated. Accusations against a respected family were dangerous. Reputations mattered, and the Monniers had one of the cleanest in the city. But something about the letter felt too specific to ignore. When police arrived at the house, nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was elegant. The air downstairs smelled normal. Louise greeted them with composure, irritation even. She was offended by the implication. Then they went upstairs. The door was locked. The smell came first, not the smell of old age or sickness, but the smell of neglect layered over time. When the door was forced open, the room revealed something that didn't belong to the living world. Blanche lay on a filthy mattress, naked, skeletal, surrounded by waste and insects. The shutters were nailed shut. Darkness had been her only companion for 25 years. When light entered the room, Blanche screamed, not because she was afraid, but because light physically burned her eyes. Witnesses later said she recoiled like an animal dragged into daylight. Her body trembled, her skin reacted violently, and yet, when spoken to gently, she responded. She whispered. She begged. She said she was cold. She said she was hungry. That detail alone destroys every attempt to romanticize or soften this story. Blanche was still there. Her mind had not vanished. Her soul had not left. She had simply been waiting. Louise Monnier was arrested almost immediately. But here is something that unsettles me deeply. Louise did not collapse. She did not confess. She did not beg forgiveness. She maintained that she had acted out of necessity, that she was protecting her daughter, that Blanche was unstable, that it was all misunderstood. And then, before justice could fully confront her, Louise died in custody, No trial, no sentence. Just an ending that feels far too gentle for the damage done. Marcel, Blanche's brother, did stand trial. His defense was chilling in its simplicity. He claimed obedience. He claimed loyalty. He claimed fear of his mother. The court showed mercy. He served a reduced sentence. And Blanche? Blanche was taken to a hospital. The world expected recovery, salvation, a return to humanity. But trauma does not dissolve in fresh air. Blanche struggled with light, sound, and touch. She was terrified of open spaces. She resisted clothing. She resisted mirrors. She resisted the world that had abandoned her. Doctors tried to rehabilitate her. Journalists tried to interview her. The public turned her into a symbol. Some called her a martyr. Others called her mad. Few understood her. She was transferred to a psychiatric institution where she lived the remainder of her life. Not free, just relocated. This is the part people rarely want to sit with. Rescue does not erase damage. Blanche survived imprisonment, but she never reclaimed the life that was stolen from her. She died years later, still bearing the psychological scars of confinement. And public reaction? Outrage, shock, then distance. The case horrified France. Newspapers printed illustrations of the dark room. Editorials questioned maternal authority, family power, and social blindness. For a moment, society looked into the mirror. And then, slowly, it looked away. Because acknowledging Blanche Monnier fully would require admitting something unbearable, that cruelty does not always come from monsters. Sometimes it comes from mothers, from brothers, from neighbors who choose silence. Sometimes it comes from a society that values reputation more than truth. The Monnier house became infamous, but infamy fades. What lingers is the uncomfortable question no one likes to ask. How many people sensed something was wrong and chose comfort over confrontation? Because Blanche's suffering wasn't hidden underground. It was upstairs, in plain sight. When I first encountered this story, I didn't see it as a historical curiosity. I saw it as a warning. Because the most disturbing part of Blanche Monnier's story isn't the locked door, the darkness, or even the 25 years stolen from her life. It's how normal everything around it looked. This wasn't a war zone. This wasn't a slum. This wasn't a place society had abandoned. This was a respectable home, a respected family, a mother praised for her virtue, and that's exactly why this story matters. We like to believe cruelty announces itself loudly, that abuse wears obvious masks, that evil is chaotic, violent, and impossible to miss. But Blanche's life proves the opposite. Sometimes cruelty is organized, sometimes it is polite. Sometimes it is justified as discipline, duty, or protection. From this channel's perspective, Blanche Monnier is not just a victim of one mother's obsession. She is the product of a system that allowed absolute parental control over women's lives, especially unmarried daughters. A system where a woman's desires were considered dangerous if they conflicted with family honor, where obedience was mistaken for morality, where love, especially female love, was something to be controlled, not respected. And what troubles me deeply is how easily people around the Monnier household accepted the disappearance. She must have left. She must have chosen another life. She must have been unstable. Those explanations were comforting. They allowed society to avoid asking harder questions. This channel exists to sit with those uncomfortable truths, to examine what happens when power is concentrated inside private spaces where no one wants to look too closely. Blanche's imprisonment forces us to question something we still struggle with today. How many forms of abuse survive because they are wrapped in tradition? How often does control masquerade as care? How many people are silenced, not by force, but by reputation? And let's talk about the brother. It's easy to focus all our anger on the mother, but silence has accomplices. Doing nothing is not neutral. Marcel Monnier lived his life while his sister rotted upstairs. He chose safety over courage, order over justice, comfort over humanity. And society rewarded him with leniency. That should unsettle us, because it reveals a pattern we still see. Those who maintain the status quo are often forgiven. Those who disrupt it are punished. Blanche disrupted it by loving someone she was not supposed to love. That was enough. From this channel's point of view, Blanche Monnier represents a category of stories that are often forgotten because they don't fit clean narratives. There is no redemption arc here, no triumphant escape, no late life justice, just survival, followed by permanent damage. And that is exactly why her story deserves to be told. Not as spectacle, not as shock value, but as a reminder that behind many perfect families, There may be locked doors we never question. I want to ask you something honestly. If you lived in Poitiers at that time, if you knew the Monnier personally, if you respected Louise Monnier, would you have believed the rumors? Would you have knocked on that door? Or would you have chosen the comfort of disbelief? Because history isn't just shaped by villains. It's shaped by ordinary people deciding when to look away. And Blanche Monnier paid the price for that choice. This channel doesn't exist to tell you what to think. It exists to make sure stories like this don't disappear quietly again. Blanche Monnier did not return to the world as the woman she once was. She returned as someone altered beyond repair. After her rescue, people expected transformation. They wanted to believe that sunlight, food, freedom could undo 25 years of darkness. That there would be a moment where Blanche stood up, spoke clearly, and reclaimed what was stolen. That moment never came. Blanche lived the rest of her life in institutions, moving from one controlled space to another. The doors were no longer locked by her mother, but the walls still existed. Her fear of light never fully faded. Her body remained fragile. Her mind, shaped by decades of isolation, could not simply rejoin the rhythm of normal life. And yet, she was no longer completely erased. Her name survived. What stays with me is not the image of the dark room, but the silence that followed her rescue. After the newspapers moved on, after the outrage cooled, Blanche slipped back into obscurity. No monuments, no public apology, no real reckoning. Her mother died without facing a full trial. Her brother served a reduced sentence and returned to society. The city returned to normal. Blanche carried the consequences alone. This is the quiet cruelty of history. The ones who suffer most rarely get closure. The ones who cause harm often get explanations, excuses, and forgiveness. Blanche Monnier's story lingers not because it is sensational, but because it exposes something deeply human. The need to thing, control, the fear of shame, the willingness to sacrifice another person's life for social order. When people talk about her now, they often call her the woman locked in, is a room. But that misses the point. Blanche was not defined by that room. She was defined by what she endured inside it. She survived 25 years without love, touch, or freedom, and still responded to kindness when it finally arrived. That alone speaks volumes. Some stories are loud. They end with justice, revenge, or redemption. This one ends quietly, with a woman who never asked to be a symbol, but became one anyway. A reminder that the most dangerous prisons are sometimes built inside families that respectability can hide. Unimaginable harm. That obedience, when demanded without compassion, can destroy lives. Blanche Monnier's life asks us to remember something uncomfortable. That silence can be as violent as action. That ignoring suffering is a choice. That doing nothing is never neutral. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now you know this one. And once you know it, you can't unknow it. That is her legacy.